season finale for the Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices tonight. So first of all, before we get into our panel with the wonderful EPA, yes, that's how we going out, y'all. We are talking about environmental justice with the EPA. That's how we do it around here. I would like to just take this time and tell you thank you so much for learning what environmental justice looks like in the state of Ohio, what it looks like to self-determine, and what it looks like for us to be a part of the conversations. So we've had talks around policy and life-changing bills that we here at Bell and that CommEN Strategies are pushing forward. And we've also talked about workforce development. We have talked about what it looks like when we self-determine and how to execute those things and how to hold people accountable. But with that said, we're ending tonight on the EPA. The EPA is the Environmental Protection Association, and we have 3 of their experts here today to come and have a holistic conversation about why the EPA prioritizes environmental justice and the work that they do with organizations much like Bell, much like CommEN Strategies, to make sure that people, leaders on the ground like us, find ways to do the work. So tonight, this conversation is really just an amalgamation of everything we've been talking about, but really from a different perspective, because we are now talking to people who create the standards for policy, y'all, at the federal level around environmental justice. And I couldn't have it any other way. Before I introduce our guests and everything else tonight, what I'm going to do is actually turn it over to Samia Gray. Samia is one of the leaders and executive directors for Black environmental leaders, who also is a part of this coalition for making sure that we can have this conversation together. She's going to take a couple minutes just to tell us about what the juice is in this powerful movement that we're building in the state of Ohio, and how to be a part of it, and also to spearhead into this conversation we're going to have with the EPA today. So go ahead, Samia.
Well, Jasmine, thank you. It is an honor and a privilege. I bring you greetings of peace and ease. My name, as Jasmine said, is Samia Bray. I am the co-director of Black Environmental Leaders Association. And the association is important because it is where the power is. The power happens through the association of our members with one another in the work that we do in all areas of both the built and the natural environment. Today, we're talking about energy, and we're talking about equity, and we're talking about waste reduction. However, throughout the family of Bell, we're ringing that bell for economic and environmental justice. And so today it is an amazing moment for me personally, because it's kind of like full circle, right? When we started this series, Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices, thanks to the support of the Joyce Foundation, we wanted to have a conversation for Ohioans, where Ohioans could share their voice and hear information and learn about information that is accurate, right? We wanted to make sure people had accurate information about how things work. Sometimes we hear things said about how they think it works or who did what. We really wanted to provide that. So tonight's conversation is about that level of accuracy, accountability, and also transparency. In that regard, though, I want to go back in history just a little bit. Here in Cleveland, some of you might have known that around 50 years ago, the river burned. Yeah, water caught fire. And that water caught fire. And we at that time had the first African-American mayor at that time was Carl Stokes. And it was Carl Stokes who was actually being followed around because he was the first Black mayor of a major city. He was being followed around by some media. And so he saw that opportunity to be a voice for environmental justice and to lift up the fact that how could the Cuyahoga River catch fire? As a result of that conversation, his brother Louis Stokes and other lawmakers within Congress brought forward several things. One of them being the Environmental Protection Agency. And so today, for us as Black Environmental Leaders Association, being founded in Cleveland, Ohio, to be able to come full circle with our season finale to talk with the EPA about what they really do, right? Not what we think or what they should, but what they really do, so that all hands on these issues are appropriately communicated with and to. And so thank you again, Alan, Matthew, Kathy, for being with us today. We're going to be talking about lots of things, one of which we've talked about through the season, which was the Energy Jobs and Justice Act, and elements of that. But, it's really not about the legislation. It's about good energy policy. And good energy policy, the tenets of good energy policy include a couple things. And those are the things that we're lifting up in these conversations. One is equity, right? Equitable distribution. Recently, we've had numerous cities in Ohio that have been experiencing blackouts. And I can't help but wonder if good energy policy was in place like EJA, right? Or legislation like this, good comprehensive energy policy that brought equity, right? It looked at those decisions through an equity lens. It was about waste reduction, and it also has a level of accountability and transparency on the front end, not the back end, the front end, that some of the things that people in communities of color and others are experiencing right now could potentially be working out differently. So don't have a crystal ball, so I can't say for sure. But what I can say is when we get good people having honest conversations, things get better. And so today we have our guests with us, Alan, Matthew, Kathy from the EPA. We thank you. We appreciate you. And we look forward to what you have to share with us today. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Jasmine, and enjoy the magic carpet ride that we're getting ready to partake upon with each and every one of you.
Yes, thank you, Samia. And it ain't a shame, I always forget association at the end. It's to the point where every time we host one of these, I always have to tell myself to remember to say that. And I always forget in the intro. So with that, we're just going to learn really quickly before we give Matthew, Alan, and Kathy the floor, and we start asking questions like, what is the EPA? Because I know a lot of times we have to go back and just give rudimentary education about how things came into this world. Samia gave a great segue for that. And go ahead, Matthew, Alan, or Kathy, at any point, if I'm getting things wrong, please straighten it out for me, because that's the type of environment that we have here. So again, 1970, right, y'all, is when the EPA was started. It was started by an executive order signed by President Richard Nixon, because things like the Cuyahoga River were on fire in the real world 50 years ago, like in places that our family members or us who have been or live in Cleveland have been by. We've been to an actual ecological and environmental disaster that played a formulation in there. If we fast forward or backtrack to 1969, would also what also led to, and sorry if y'all hear the sound, my computer is on its last leg right now. So if y'all can hear a sound, please let me know. I'm going to try to fix that once I come off of, once I mute myself and I begin asking the questions. But with that being said, in 1969, there was also legislation that President Nixon signed into law that actually laid the bedrock for what will become the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. And this was that there needed to be quantifiable data about environmental impacts across the United States. And it just so happened it was real timely because things were on fire. So we fast forward to, I believe, Matthew, was it 1992 when your office was created, correct? Which is the Office of Environmental Justice. And oh gosh, I can really hear my computer, so I apologize about that in advance. I'm actually going to turn that over to you, Matthew, if you can just tell us a little bit after you introduce yourself about the Office of Environmental Justice, and I'm going to get my computer under control, okay?
Yeah. No problem. We'll hopefully we can pick it up for a little while for you, Jasmine, while you get that game of Space Invaders that's happening in your computer somewhere to go chill out. Well, hey everyone, Matthew Tejada. My pronouns are he, him. Yeah, and going back to that, I mean, a few things just about EPA. It was founded by President Nixon back in the late 60s. 1970 actually was when EPA kind of recognizes as the beginning of the Environmental Protection Agency. A few things to understand. going back to rudimentary, but these are things that we have to remind folks of all the time, including, elected officials in Washington. We are not the part of the government that protects birds and otters and bears and wolves, and that's Department of the Interior, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, National Parks. Those are in different parts of the government. EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, we are actually a public health agency. We are protecting your health, the health of human beings in the United States, from threats, from environmental threats. And as Samia very rightly pointed out, those environmental threats can come from either the natural environment or from the built environment, right? The things that we have done to the environment to change it so that we can exist in it, or exist in our modern way in the environment. And that was a pretty new idea. It's still a fairly new idea that the government was going to create an agency to regulate many forms, many things that happen in life in the United States, that we were going to regulate them. If you just look around where you are right now, if you look around at, some of the things that are in your computers, the paint on your walls, the materials that your home was built with, the sorts of chemicals that are used in your home or around your yard or in the fields where we grow our food, that's the EPA. The EPA is actually in charge of regulating those things, parts of our everyday life, to make sure that those things don't actually harm public health. That was in 1970 and continues to be to this day a fairly controversial proposition in the United States. EPA is still a fairly controversial agency in our country because of the very clear impact we have on parts of our economy, on parts of just daily life in the United States. But going back to Carl Stokes, which was great, Samia, I'd never heard of Carl Stokes. So that's the thing I learned right off the bat from this. I was looking him up on Wikipedia while you were talking. The driver for it, though, was that we had some laws and there were some, feeble attempts before 1970 to try to protect human beings from those sorts of environmental public health threats, but they weren't effective. And I think what we've seen over the 50 years of the EPA being around is the EPA has been incredibly effective at protecting public health and the environment for most of the people in the United States. It has not been very effective at protecting public health and the environment for some people in the United States and for some communities. And those are typically communities of color and low income and indigenous communities. And I'm sure we're going to talk much more about that, but that's what environmental justice is about. It's about recognizing that, the ways that the systems and the structures that have been set up over the 50 years of the EPA's existence and the things that led to that beforehand, they were not set up in ways that help protect communities of color and low-income communities. And that's our job at EPA. That's Alan and Kathy and a bunch of other folks' jobs at EPA, is to work with those programs, to work on those systems and structures, to try to get them to appreciate that difference, to try to get them to understand that we're not still protecting the health and environments of many communities across the United States. And to do so might mean that we need to change some of our systems and structures. We might need to change some of our policies. We might need to change the way we use our tools to make them fit the realities on the ground for communities of color. So just like you're talking about the EJA bill, right? The EJA bill being written in a way that's more equitable. That's exactly the sort of stuff that we're doing inside of the government. We're looking at these existing laws, these existing policies, and we're working to try to change them from the inside to make them more equitable, to make them more just, so that they'll actually work in the ways for the people in the communities that need them to work the most.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing that while I was in the middle of having technological issues. And you spoke on beautifully why we actually have your office and your role. And I'm actually going to touch more on that because we are going to be talking about the impact of environmental justice and issues on BIPOC people and people of color who historically are often left out of this conversation, which led to your role in the creation of your office. But before we get into that conversation, I would actually like to pivot really quickly to Alan to give us a chance to get everybody introduced. So Alan, could you tell us your name, your type, well, your name, we just said, but your title? Tell us a little bit about your role at the EPA and what are your primary focuses. And I just want to remind everybody that while a lot is going on, please remember to be muted in the meantime, because you can hear my dog barking in the background. So I'm going to mute myself and give you the center stage. Alan.
Okay, thank you so much, Jasmine. Hello, everybody. I'm Alan Waltz. I am currently the director of the Tribal and Multimedia Programs Office in EPA Region 5. And so along with environmental justice, which I'll talk about more in a minute, that includes working with the 35 tribal nations that are located within the Great Lakes region. It includes work on environmental education, children's health, work with schools to help schools provide healthy learning environments. And we also do, it's called the National Environmental Policy Act, also from like 1970. I see Jasmine nodding her head, NEPA. So we run that program and review projects under NEPA. And then we also have the international program. So lots of wonderful kind of cross-cutting stuff. And really at the heart of our office in many ways is our work to support communities and advance equity. We've got our environmental justice program at the heart of that, along with our children's health work, our environmental education work. NEPA, we need to do environmental justice through NEPA. We need to do environmental justice in our work with tribes, but most importantly, we work across the entire region. So Matt did just a beautiful job of laying out what EPA's purpose is and what our lane is. I'll kind of break that down a little bit within that in describing our role as the environmental justice program, along with Kathy, is to make sure that no matter what of our tools we are using, we are centering equity in that work. And it really also reflects the fact that outside of that responsibility that was placed upon EPA in 1970, we just crossed our 50-year anniversary as an agency. So we are quite young. I'd say maybe we're lucky to be adolescent in agency years. I've been around for 26 of those, which feels hard to believe, and have always been very conscious from the time I walked in the door that before we had an environmental movement, we had a civil rights movement that gave us a number of very significant laws before the laws that created EPA came along. So when we started our mission, we started that mission in the context of a struggle for racial and economic equity that was already going on. And we had to figure out how to step into that. When I researched the history of EPA, I find that even back before we had fancy maps, back when we were drawing things out by hand, we already understood that Chicago and Northeast Indiana were getting more particulate matter than other parts of the country. We already understood that. Now we finally have the tools and the leadership and the policy infrastructure to really do something about it. So a key place to do something about it is in continuing to advance the science. A lot of EPA's folks are really scientists, and they're there to try to answer the questions that we need to answer to know what protection even looks like, what standards should we even set. Within that, there are opportunities for participatory research. So great environmental leaders such as yourselves can identify a question that you have. You can ask EPA about it. And if we don't know the answer, that might become a research project that we would engage in to really better understand the conditions so that we could end disproportionate and cumulative impacts based on that information. So how do we approach that? Well, we've got our statutes, but then we write rules to guide how we interpret those statutes, and then policies and guidance that further refine that. Another important place for leaders such as yourselves to raise your voices is if you're wondering, why does EPA do things the way it does? It just might be that that's a policy that's a little bit out of date and is not sufficiently conscious of the context of racial and economic inequity that shape how we do our jobs, we might need to be more proactive and do more in our policies to change the status quo. And you can help us see that by bringing information to us. When you see those inequities happening, you'd let us know and see if there's a way that we can just change, not only address that situation, but change the way we do business for the long term, for the better. The way we do business now, like once we've got our standards in place, once we've got our rules and our policies in place, our three main tools, I would say, are enforcement, which I spent about 10 years managing our enforcement programs. It's a powerful tool to at least make sure that everyone is in full compliance with the legal requirements, to show up and make sure that we're protecting the community where there are multiple facilities. One of the first things we can do is make sure that we're getting that compliance. And EPA's relationship with states and local government is such that if we see an issue that is best done by our partners, we can let our partners know about it. So you can just kind of come to us and of course, work with your state and local government, but know that when you get to EPA, we will turn around and we will engage them as well for a holistic solution. So enforcement is a really important tool, and you can always let us know. Again, if you see something out of whack that doesn't look right, that might be an enforcement issue. You can let us know and we will look into it. The other main tool that we're really focused on is permitting. How do we make sure that specific facilities are complying with their standards in a way that is enforceable, so we can make sure we are holding them to the requirements of protectiveness of public health? That's very important to us, and we're really trying to move out in terms of encouraging our permitting programs to be more aggressive in asking the right questions about whether or not the potential for disproportionate impacts and cumulative impacts has been fully considered in particular permits. So a lot of our work now in this administration, as we're trying to take this to the next level, is refining that guidance and developing that guidance so we can be much more effective in that really important space of permitting. And then the third big area is working with communities side by side. Community-based work where we're bringing all those tools I mentioned and more to the table along with our partners and trying to come up with creative solutions that advance the community's vision of well-being in its economic, environmental, and social dimensions. And that can definitely involve, so you're talking about the blackouts earlier, that can absolutely involve investments to help communities be more resilient to climate change. There are a lot of investments we can make in our infrastructure, in our water infrastructure, in green infrastructure to both beautify neighborhoods and make them more less heat islands and more resistant to climate change. There's a lot that we can do in that space as well. So I've been blessed to work in almost all those areas during my career. And now I'm at a point where it's it's the tribal work, it's the environmental justice work, and it's the NEPA work is really where we're centering ourselves now.
Thank you so much. There was times when you were literally saying things and I was like quite literally clapping over here muted because you basically said everything that I agree, and it goes down to the tenets. So preparing for this, I spent a lot of time on the EPA website, specifically in the Environmental Justice Department. And what you're really talking about is the collaborative partnerships, which is what I really enjoy about the EPA, which then we might be the scientists, but we might not know what real life execution looks like out here, and we need that sort of coming together where science and real world lived experiences come together to be able to create this partnership. I know a lot of agencies don't do that, so that's one of the things I thoroughly enjoyed. And then you basically laid out the policy, which we're going to talk a little bit more about why the EPA is needed to give state and local departments directive around environmental justice, because this is very much so an issue that many municipalities and states are taking on, whereas the EPA has been doing this and tackling these questions for 25 years. And so I actually want to give Kathy, who works up under Alan, a chance to introduce herself and kind of give a scope of the work that she does here in Region 5 also, which is the Great Lakes region. And then we are going to move forward with a couple of questions to round out the rest of the panel. Go ahead, Kathy, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jasmine. So, yep, my name is Kathy Trintofilo. I'm the Region 5 Environmental Justice Coordinator. So I do work in Alan's shop. So, I was giggling when you asked, Alan, what's your focus? Because I was going to say, well, my focus is whatever his focus is, right? And Alan's focus is whatever Matt's telling him to focus on. But anyway, so I've been with EPA about 25 years. And so when Alan touched about enforcement, the most of my career has been in enforcement, and I've been blessed to kind of work cross media, right? So when we've got our experts in air and in water and in land and Superfund and all our other programs, and so I know a little bit to be dangerous in all of them, right? And so putting me in this position, it's like when I hear communities call me and residents and they're telling me their stories, I can make those connections. And I feel really good being able to really advocate for them within our office, right? And so a lot of, folks are calling, and as we're kind of peeling back those layers, I'm able to make a lot more connections, I hope, making a lot more connections to be able to bring as much benefit and resources, attention to those problematic, areas. I'm also a data person, right? So, I like to look at things and I can see the uneven distribution of environmental burdens, right? So I know where we should be helping to focus, our work in those areas. And so, being on the ground, right, and teaching our folks. So like one of the things that I'm focusing on is making sure our programs understand what integration of environmental justice means into their programs, right? What does that mean? What does it look like? How to get them started or to enhance what they're already doing. And a big portion of that is that meaningful involvement, right? So we're trying to get our folks feeling comfortable talking to the community, listening to what they have, and trying to integrate, what we're hearing into, potentially a project or cases, whatever that may be. So, I'm super happy to be here and looking forward to hearing a lot of the questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here, Kathy. And it was so funny. We was like, my direction is their direction. But I love that you said, I know a little bit to be dangerous, because that resonates with me as an organizer. I know just enough. And if I don't know the information, I know the person to get you the information or get you the desired outcome. And I think we have to tackle environmental justice in a holistic way, where we know we might not be the subject experts on everything, but we have to be able to work together, because this is a multi-tier issue. And with that being said, I'm going to round that back out to Matthew, because I really loved the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, their definition of fair treatment, which means that no group of people should have a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, or commercial operations or policies. So my thing is, we are here for a specific purpose, right? And that specific purpose outside of education is being like, how do we get to the work? And for me, because I'm a policy head, the work is in policy. So how do we make sure this beautiful definition that the EPA came up with, and that is kind of the tenet of which your office surrounds itself by, how do we make sure that we incorporate this into a policy perspective, and how important is that for the OEJ?
It's hugely important. I mean, you're really putting your finger there. There's really two terms in that definition, which is a little old. I think we're actually, folks at the White House are looking at updating that definition and making it a definition for the whole government, not just for EPA, because EPA's definition right now is kind of the de facto definition for the whole government. But there's two real critical terms in that definition. The first one is meaningful involvement or meaningful engagement, right? The idea that, a core justice principle is that if a decision is going to be made that impacts a person or a community, they have the right to participate in that decision, right? That they have to be meaningfully engaged. They have to be available to it. They have to be able to understand it. They have to be able to participate in it. They have to have the capacity to meaningfully involve themselves in that decision, in the process that delivers that decision. We've done a lot over the 30 years of EJ at EPA in terms of developing and having more of a foundation on the meaningful engagement part of our definition. That fair treatment part, honestly, is the thing that we're really working on for the first time in a broad, serious way in this administration. To Alan's point earlier, that EPA has been around 50 years, EJ's been here for 30 years. in a lot of ways, we're just now really starting to do the hard work of what fair treatment actually means. And that means looking at things like Alan was saying, looking at those permits, right? Looking at those rules that we write, because Congress writes laws, but those laws aren't detailed enough to actually tell, corporations or other companies or other parts of the government to do what they need to do. So EPA takes those laws and we write rules that actually implement all the laws that are passed up on Capitol Hill that are supposed to be protecting health and the environment. And for 50 years, those laws and permits and rules really had not, even at their very beginning, started from a place of being fair, because they have not recognized first that there's a long history of unfairness in this country that goes back to before this country was a country, right? From the first time that Europeans set foot in front of indigenous people in this country, unfairness started, and it has continued on to present day. So our policies, our rules, our permits don't really recognize this history that has resulted in communities today facing disproportionate, unequitable challenges, threats, disinvestment, right? So we're starting from a place where things haven't recognized that for a long time. Our rules and our permits also have not, and still don't. This is one of the things that we're really working on in this administration, because they're for the first time really allowing us to work on this. They still don't start from a place of taking the reality of especially communities of color and low income communities into our actual decision. And what that means is, for instance, like when we're issuing permits. So permits, every facility that pollutes in the United States above a certain level has to have a permit. It's like a driver's license, right? We issue a license to a company that says it's legal for you to, emit this much pollution into the environment. And when we're issuing those permits, the science underlying it is, well, we think this much pollution is not going to harm people too badly, right? And the science that gets us to that understanding of, well, how much pollution is not too bad is based on, well, a single source emitting a single pollutant affecting an average individual, which typically means in science up till today has meant a middle-aged white male. That doesn't exist in most communities. It really doesn't exist in communities of color and low-income communities that are surrounded by multiple sources of pollution, have all types of pollution coming out of them. And the people that live in those communities are not average. That is a systemic, racist, classist construct that still persists to this day. So when we're talking about fair treatment, it is looking at those permits, it's looking at those rules, and for the first time trying to take the reality of, no. You've got a community of folks that have all sorts of vulnerabilities because of their social history, their demographics. There's all sorts of vulnerabilities that we have to take into account. We have to take into account, especially for communities with EJ concerns, that, that much pollution from that one facility might be okay, might not really harm people. But if you're putting it in a neighborhood that already has a dozen other sources, that's way too much. Maybe we shouldn't issue that permit, right? That's fair treatment. And that's the thing that right now in this administration, when we talk about issues of disproportionality, or really the big thing that has been a real big commitment by Administrator Regan, the head of the EPA right now, around cumulative impacts. That is kind of the brass ring here. If we can take that idea of cumulative impacts, looking at the cumulative sources, the cumulative pollution, and adding all of that up, and then think about that decision about, well, this much more, it's going to change the way that we make our decisions. And those decisions will finally start to treat people fairly, where it's going to say, no, there's already too much here. You can't, not only should this stuff already not exist, probably, you sure as heck can't bring more into this place. You're going to have to find somewhere else for it, even if it's more expensive, even if it means you have to go move your factory to a place where the land is much more expensive. So be it, right? Because this community, it's unfair if we keep piling more and more onto it. That's a really tough thing. There are a few states that actually have put laws on the books now dictating that they're going to start to say no in those permits And everyone's watching, because once facilities, kind of like a facility in Chicago recently was told no for the first time, this community has too much, you got to go somewhere else. There's a major backlash against that. And this is, that front line of fighting for equity and justice is getting really hot right now as we start to do this hard work of actually really showing folks what fairness looks like.
You just said many words, many words. And I thank you so much for saying that in particular. Please, if Kathy or Alan, y'all would like to piggyback off what he said, or if it riled you up to say something, please unmute yourself. But I live in a city, I live in Dayton, Ohio, that could readily benefit from that, especially the West Side. So here we have an over disproportionate amount of factories that blow down wind. And we need that fair treatment. We need actual EJ work happening in our communities because of the level of asthma, because of the level of lead poisoning, because many of us are returning to the earth and farmers, and we can't plant our plants in our backyards without raised flower beds because the amount of lead that's in them, because we sit downwind. Right now, they're building a new gas station at the top of the hill, and we know that gasoline transfers down and comes downwind and gets in the soil, right? And these are the things that, unless knowing about the community and caring about the community and recognizing that these people are people who deserve a life where they have access to clean air, clean water, and a clean land in which they live on, those type of things, especially for a public health agency, we have to be able to do. So it makes me very happy that up under this administration, you're able to stretch your wings and really take up space around what fair treatment is, and most importantly, the execution of it. And this is a everybody question coming up next. And so picking back off what Matthew said, why is it so important that our state and local officials understand the importance of prioritizing environmental justice when we are talking about ecological, geological, and environmental issues? And I use issues in air quote because I understand that environmental justice is an environmental issue, and you can't separate the people from the issues, and you can't separate the sociology from the actual science of how do we make this community healthy. I feel like a lot of our elected officials may misunderstand that because a lot of them are not environmentalists. So if anybody could think of one or two things to express urgency to the Ohio legislature, but also to our state and local municipalities about why centering environmental justice is so important while tackling these environmental issues, what would they be? Particularly for a person like Kathy, you spent 25 years in the field, just linking people up. What's some of that feedback that you get when you're talking to municipalities, and how do you overcome these issues? Sorry about that, y'all. I'm on my phone. This is bad.
Yeah, no worries, Jasmine. Fantastic questions. I mean, that's really at the heart of it. I think one thing I'd say, and then certainly we welcome Kathy's thoughts and Matthew's thoughts as well, is, the condition of disproportionate impacts, the condition of cumulative impacts comes from decades of decisions made by local and state government as well as federal government. EPA is just one player in there that has to try to do the right thing going forward, but we all have a shared responsibility. If we look at the lived experience, and there are in fact health disparities, there's no stronger proof of cumulative impacts than health disparities. That the pollution is greater in an area with greater asthma, right? It speaks for itself. So if we recognize the problem and we recognize that we have a shared responsibility, then it really is all hands on deck. And that's what I would want local and state government to hear. It's not that we're going to tell them, you need to fix this problem we found. It's that we want to tell them, we have to fix this problem together. And local government sets the terms for land use and zoning. Local government ultimately is deciding what kinds of business can be done where, right? And so where those choices are rooted in redlining and other intentionally discriminatory choices about land use, you have to do what Chicago is doing and try to proactively, based on the current understanding of the science and what is the right thing to do, try to rework your zoning. So that's a local government responsibility to think how land use has contributed and reinforces a legacy of disproportionate impacts. At the state level, states do most of the permitting. They do most of the enforcement under federal environmental law. So if we don't have our state partners recognizing, whatever you think about, environmental justice, the fact remains that if in a place that's cumulatively impacted, we're not protecting human health and the environment. That should matter to any state environmental agency. And then it's a question of, all right, state, you've got all the tools EPA has, and you're the front line to run most of these programs. What are we going to do together to apply those laws and solve these problems, and then get creative beyond that to see how we can collaborate and move things from a state of full compliance and trying to address cumulative impacts to a state of flourishing and well-being.
Go ahead, Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, everything that Alan said, and then just the reality of it, right, is, I could look and collect as much data as I can behind my computer, right? But it's that local data, it's that local knowledge, right? So we need our local government and our state agencies that are probably closer and know more of those issues to take care of those issues. Because, by the time that, we receive a complaint at US EPA, they've gone through all those chains of people, and it's been that long period of time. And so being able to encourage our states to, really centralize, and focus in on communities that, have EJ concerns and issues, we're trying to move in that direction. But yeah, I mean, everything that Alan said, and then, knowing that it's the best, avenue for a speedy and resolving issue is going to be that at that local level.
And just one thing to add too onto that, on that local thing, is that we can't do anything at EPA by ourselves. Nobody does anything because Alan, Kathy, or I walk into somebody else's office and say, change this or go there or do that, because we don't have any authority to do anything. We have zero authority at EPA. What we can do, though, is walk into somebody's office and say, hey, I got 5 phone calls this morning. There is something happening on the west side. You need to get somebody out there. What we can do is, we can call Ohio EPA and say, hey, there's something happening in Cincinnati with overland flooding and combined sewer overflows, and we need y'all to get on it because people are upset and it's not right down there. And it's going to be holy hell if y'all don't start figuring this out, right? It's the community voice is the absolute foundation of our ability to do anything on environmental justice across the entire government. And if folks in their communities do not speak up and speak out for what you need to see happen, for what needs to change in your communities at every opportunity, when you see something that needs to change, when there is a permit out for renewal, when there is a hearing about a rule coming up. And I know that when I used to do this work before I came to EPA, I was a EJ advocate in Houston. And by the time before I got hired into EPA, I was tired of showing up at EPA hearings. I would not go to an EPA hearing again because I'd have to go to Dallas for most of them. And I started telling folks, if you want me to go up to Dallas, you got to buy me a plane ticket. I'm not driving 4 hours again for a 3-minute slot for a bunch of people to not even look at me while I'm talking. I'll tell you right now, though, after being inside of EPA for 10 years almost, the only thing that makes the government, EPA included, do anything different is if community members raise their voices and force the government to respond.
Yes, I love that. And there's 2 things that I would like to add. Number one, that was perfect segue into a question that we got from the live off of Facebook. And this person said, let me make sure, I want to make sure their name is completely right, because I believe in giving people their credit. They didn't say who they were, but who is the best agency, who is an advocate when the EPA is not responsive, is the question that we got from the live.
Who's the best agency when EPA is not? It kind of depends on the issue. I mean, there are There are good people there are good people everywhere. There are a lot of good EJ advocates in other parts of the federal government, particularly some of the big agencies. The Department of Energy has got some really rock'em sock'em EJ leaders, especially right now in them. Department of Transportation has got some great folks in it. There's a lot of states as well that have some really great EJ leaders. I haven't engaged that much with folks in Ohio. I mentioned Cincinnati. That's the only city I've been to in Ohio, and I'm about to go back there again later this summer. You know, I think one of the things that that we're always looking for and that we can help with, even if it's not an EPA issue necessarily, I get lots of emails and calls from community folks across the country like, hey, you know, I'm in Corpus Christi and we're having a housing issue, or hey, we're in Rochester, New York, and they're trying to build a highway again right through our neighborhood. And a lot of times, one of the most powerful things we can do is just help people navigate the government from inside the government. So we say, okay, I know this person, or let me make or let me send an email or make a phone call, or hey, I bumped into somebody here, or you know, we can help. That's part of the reason that the EJ program was created at EPA, and the EJ program was created because of EJ leaders demanding it, because of community leaders demanding it, is so that there would be us on the inside for you folks on the outside. We're there for you. We're there to help you navigate. We're there to help give you information, to give you insight, you know, so that we can sit down and say, what are y'all trying to do? Okay, here's the reality of, you know, if you do it this way, this is what's going to happen inside of government. If you do it this way, though, it's going to happen this way. So you all decide which way you want to do. It's still the community's decision on how you want to approach something, but we're there to help be your inside folks.
Thank you for that. I know a lot of us as community leaders feel kind of intimidated when having to navigate agency. So sometimes it means a lot for us to just be like, hey, we know somebody we can reach out to who is at least willing to do the help. Because I know as an organizer, that's something I've been faced up against. And I wanted to also give this, as far as policy, I'm gonna keep it real. The reason why I asked that question was because the EPA, the OEJ and the EPA released two documents related to the enforcement and the rulemaking process around policy. And I think that's a really good place to start for a lot of our legislators and a lot of our municipal leaders and elected officials at the municipal level is looking at those two, which is the guidance on considering environmental justice during the development of action. This is basically just about what rulemaking action looks like, and also the technical guidance for assessing environmental justice in regulatory analysis, which is very important for how we translate rules that are given down from the federal level and we flip them down to make it make sense at a state and local level. And I love that some of that hard work is already being done about how we can flip those things into policy. So for all of our legislators who are watching this, I just wanted to throw that out there. And what we're going to do next is move into the good stuff, right? We're moving into how do we partner with the EPA? And so what I want to talk about now is what is the environmental justice funded programs? Can and how can impacted communities get support from this directive or become a part of this as a partnership between themselves and the EPA?
Well, I'll say one thing to kind of tee up for Kathy and Alan, and then I'll talk a little bit about our grants plans. So first of all, for a long time, for probably about 15 years, we've had a very small budget for EJ at EPA. And that budget allowed the national program that I run out of DC. So EPA has 10 regional offices, right? There's EPA in DC, and then there's 10 other EPA offices across the United States that are responsible for certain states. That's how the federal government kind of breaks up the United States. I've been able for about 15 years to pay for one full-time EJ person in every office. That's Kathy in Region 5. So she's in Chicago. She's responsible for several states. One person doing EJ over several states is ridiculous, right? So Kathy is constantly just scrambling, trying to do all the different parts of her job. We got a substantial budget increase because this president asked for the first time ever for a substantial budget increase. So Kathy's office is going to go from 1 to 12 people that I'm going to be paying for environmental justice. And so I'm just teeing that up so Kathy and Alan can talk about that in a minute. I'm going to talk about, because they're going to be the front line. Like, that's why those folks are in the regions, are to have those relationships with organizations like y'all. On the other side, though, for our grants, and we talked about this yesterday at the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. These are still in plan, but they're plans that are going to start to happen fairly quickly. So we're going to have a number of grant offerings that come out here over the next few months, specifically for community-based organizations. And the EJ program, we really focus the vast majority of our resources to go to community-based organizations, not chapters of big organizations, not organizations that work all over the place, but community-based local organizations. And so one of those is going to be, we've had for a long time a small grant competition, which was typically around $50,000. We actually raised that a couple of years ago to about $90,000. So it's a small grant. It's just for community-based organizations to be able to get started, to do a little monitoring, to do a little organizing, to do some educating. But organizations still have to go through the entire federal application process to get that money. I tried to do it 3 times when I was running my organization in Houston. I never got a single EJ grant when I was in Houston, because it is a hard process. It is, and it's a government process. It's just tough. So one of the things we're going to do now that we have a bunch more money is we're actually going to do just a couple of big grants, hopefully, to a couple of outside organizations that will then be able to make sub-grants. And all community organizations will have to do is write, a 4 or 5 page project summary and send it in and get a grant. So we're trying to really reduce the barrier to small organizations to get those initial, $100,000, $90,000 grants. So that's going to be coming out here in the next few months. So hopefully we'll have this new ability for organizations to just apply for that. If there are community-based organizations that have more funding, though, we are going to have another grant competition that we still will run. So organizations will have to have a little more capacity to fill out the federal grant application, but that's going to go up to several $100,000. And that's going to actually pay for community-based organizations to work through that collaborative problem-solving model that you were talking about. Everything we do in the EJ program is based on collaborations. Nobody can show up in a community with EJ concerns all by themselves and just solve everything. You have to have multiple levels of government, business and industry. Everyone has got to come to a table that the community has set and take our seats at the community's table, ready to work with the community to further the vision of the future that the community has laid out. So we have this other grant competition that again is several $100,000 for multiple years to really support communities, to have folks take a seat at that table and work on the solutions to actually implement in the community. That's going to be coming out probably in mid-fall. We'll announce that. Those are open, and that'll just be an open grant competition. It'll probably be open for 3 months. We do multiple assistance calls where we get on and we explain everything and we take questions. It is a competition, though, so once we announce those things, like, we can't interact directly with an organization to help them because that's unfair. So we have to do just everything very broadly, very openly. But if y'all's organization or other organizations that are listening, we have a grants page on our website. You can just put in EPA EJ grants. I'm sure, Jasmine, you found it. We have lots of examples of past grants that we funded. We have the forms that folks have had to fill out in the past. You can look at those to start getting ready, and just know that those grants are going to start coming around kind of in the fall of this year. And again, we've only had about a little over $1 million a year every year. All we've had is about $1 million for those grants. We got $40 million for those grants this year. All right, we think we're going to get $40 million again next year. So a lot more funding is going to be available over the next few years. So those grants are going to be a great way for communities to start to get those resources to start working on this. And then I'll stop and Alan talk about just the regional stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. So in addition to all those great resources, I mentioned before that sometimes we can do research projects. And so there's people power here too, right? So we can bring expertise to the table. We can bring science to the table and work with community partners on priorities. And we also have contracts to provide technical assistance, facilitation, different resources like that that we can target so that we can be good contributors to, you know, community-wide effort where you got your state and local government doing everything that they can. We want to make sure we're, you know, helping to fill in the spots where we need to. So if you're looking at that webpage that Matthew mentioned and you're not seeing a resource that seems like it fits the issue that you're trying to work on, you can always, again, just reach out to the Environmental Justice Program and explore with us what kinds of resources we might be able to put together in terms of people power, contracts, things like that. And I'll just share an example of a kind of investment we've made actually right in Dayton. We partnered with the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, which has centered equity in its mission, and worked together with them to present an Environmental Justice Academy. We just had a beautiful graduation ceremony a couple weekends ago, right? So that's a place where the bulk of the actual investment was made by our local partners. And we just brought the curriculum and the people and the, you know, the EPA technical resources. So when it comes down to solving problems, use all the resources Matthew talked about, but then also talk with your region and let us see if we can help to navigate the agencies and our own programs and see if we can put something together that really fits the priorities that you have in a particular place.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned something so important with the planning committee here in Dayton, because one of our environmental leaders who's been just taking up an immense amount of space was one of the first graduates, Deja Demings, who's actually supposed to be on tonight. But she's a superhero and she's running multiple after-school programs right now in our community in the summertime to give our children positive things to do to beat this heat in the summer, this unfathomably hot heat in Southwestern Ohio. So thank you for that. And just to piggyback with a lot of these things coming, because we do not want to miss this $40 million that they have been talking about. So how do our organizations who would like to go through this process or already have a process worked out where we can receive federal funding, how do we keep in contact with the EPA, with Region 5, right, with the Great Lakes office to know, hey, deadlines are coming up, interactions are coming up. Also knowing your website, you also have webinars to walk people through those. So where can people go to get on your mailing list, to get in contact and keep in contact with the EPA to kind of cultivate that relationship and be prepared when the money comes down the pipeline?
Yeah, well, I'll let Matt point you to the national EJ listserv, which is where all the regions put all their good stuff, so everyone gets to see it along with the national stuff. But we kind of keep our email list. You can just reach out to myself or Kathy, and just to spell out my email address for folks, it's Waltz, WALTS .Allen, ALAN @EPA.gov, and we'll connect you to our resources, and you'll start getting information from us, and we'll have a chance to connect with you as well. And then I see Matt just dropped the join EPA-EJ at lists.epa.gov. Just send an email to that.
Yeah, I saw that too. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you so much, Alan. So we are in the last, like, literally 2 minutes of our conversation. I feel like we're just really, I would like to have y'all back. I'm not gonna lie. I wish this was not the series finale now, because I'm loving this conversation. But with that being said, we know now that we have the footing through what Matthew has talked about with the $40 million and getting funding. And now we know the process to keep in contact with the EPA. But for people, EDs, executive directors, or anybody else who may be scared, or leaders who are scared to take up this space or create formalized partnerships with the EPA to tackle this issue. And I know Matthew said none of us can show up and do this work by ourselves. Why is it important that they take a gamble on themselves to work with the EPA to be able to do EJ work in their community?
Well, go ahead, Matt. You go first.
No, please.
Okay, I'll just say for my part, Matt kind of alluded to this before. We can't really do our jobs the right way that we want to. The reason we're here to do our jobs well depends on knowing what people's priorities are, what they want to work on. And so we not only welcome that partnership. We really depend on it. That's what the environmental justice program is about, is those authentic partnerships that help us do better for communities than we can if we're just operating on a program by program or facility by facility basis. So I would just say, don't feel like you're imposing. You're actually helping me do my job when you reach out to me.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. Like we need community folks to speak up. We need them to engage with us. We can't do our job to advance justice and equity without folks on the ground partnering with us, working with us. We know it's hard. We know it's challenging, but we're here and we are experienced in, doing what we need to do to meet communities where they're at, and to meet communities in ways that work for them. And I'd also say that, from my experience, in Houston, it's the fourth biggest city in the United States. When I started advocating for EJ, it took all of a couple weeks for folks to start to take notice, because when somebody actually raises their voice, it is incredible how rarely that happens. And you can have an impact in your community by getting informed, by getting organized, and by speaking out for your community. You can have an impact. It doesn't mean things change overnight, that nothing changes overnight. It does mean, if you're serious about it, that you're getting into a lifetime's worth of work, because we're in this for life. This is a generational struggle. But getting into that and seeing the change that can happen when people speak up and speak out and speak truth to power, it is well worth it. And it is the only thing that is going to make especially communities that face environmental injustices any better.
Thank you for that. I'm trying to keep everything balanced with my life. Thank you for that. And I'll just add on top of that, on top of what you said, Matthew, and what Alice said, it's our right to self-determine. I would say for a lot of people who've been doing environmental work for a long time, organizing in general or new, and you might feel disparaged at the uphill process. Like Matt said, nothing has changed overnight, but that doesn't mean that you take up space. You don't take up space, or you make yourself small in order to fit in with what you think that you can get accomplished. To me, the sky's the limit. The max is health, and the maximum is health in the way that I view it to be for my life. Like, that's self-determination. That's what I have to remember when I'm engaging in these spaces as an organizer, as an environmentalist, as a Black woman, as a working class woman, all these things that kind of tell me innately that I don't take up space. And I want everybody to know, we talk about this on almost every episode of Ohio Voices Informing Energy Choices, that environmental justice work is racial justice work. It is gender justice work. It is every type of work for every type of humanity that you can imagine, because we all need to survive. We all have that right. We have the right to have access to clean drinking water. We have the right to have safe and affordable homes. We have the right for the air quality. Like the past couple of days, I have asthma. Like, I would take a deep breath outside and I'd be like, I have the right to not choke. Yeah. On air, because I don't have a choice about if I breathe it or not. Like, it's a physiological condition that is automated. Like, I cannot overcome this issue at all. So a lot of times we don't know what taking up space means, but I always say be yourself, and the education can come afterwards. But you just have to know that you deserve to live a life in which you are in charge of figuring out what the future means. And with that, we are just going to close it out with this panel. And I just want to say to Matthew, to Alan, to Kathy, thank you so much. This was such a refreshing way to begin my evening and have frank conversations with people who are as passionate about fixing these issues as we are here at Bell and at CommEN Strategies. So thank you so much for your subject expertise. Thank you so much for saying what you said, because sometimes we need to know, as organizers who are doing this on the ground work day in and day out, that we're important and that our work has sizable and measurable results that leads to impact that can direct a whole federal agency, right? And that this federal agency wants to work with us and be in relationship with us if we cultivate it. So thank you for that. And this, again, is our series finale. So I didn't know if y'all had any closing words for the people on the panel. If not, I'll just move straight into the closing.
Just thank you for letting us join you in this space, and let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I love that, Jasmine. Don't make yourself small to fit into the space. You make the space fit you, and you be big,
Absolutely.
and you do what you need to do.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to be a rebel rouser, y'all.
That's right.
Because that's how we get things done. But with that being said, thank you so much for joining us tonight